What's going on, everyone? So today we're talking about some of the worst cards in Star Wars Unlimited. I got this comment quite a few times on my previous video talking about the best cards in Star Wars Unlimited. And as there are a lot of cards to Star Wars Unlimited, and when you're talking about the best ones, it automatically kind of gravitates towards, obviously some of the most played cards, most pivotal cards. When you consider worst cards, oftentimes there's a lot of commons in there, so I decided to go ahead and omit commons from this list. So these are the top 10 cards that just didn't quite make it. They either had a specific strategy in mind, and maybe in the future sets they'll work out, but they are just utterly unplayable, or just so low value that you'd rather oftentimes play a bunch of commons or other uncommons, or, well, in the best case, rares, instead of these cards. These cards are just either actively ruining your game plan or too expensive or whatever it is. We're going to be talking about all of that here. Let's dive into our first card on the list. And our first card on the list here is Smoke and Cinders. If you want to pick up any of the cards here today, be sure to use my TCG player link in the description down below, although you probably shouldn't. But here with Smoke and Cinders, it is a 5-costed aggression event. Each player discards all but 2 cards from their hand. So let's talk about the best case scenario with this card. You're playing an aggressive deck like Sabine Green. You drop your hand. You might have 3 cards in hand by the time turn 4 comes around. And boom, you play a Smoke and Cinders. You only have to discard 1 card, but your opponent discards 2 or maybe even 3 cards. And you got them, right? Here's the problem with that. 1, you've just used 5 resources as an aggro deck to not really get in damage to your opponent. And part of the reason why that's relevant is because they get to choose which cards they keep in their hand. So as soon as they see you play Smoke and Cinders, they know, oh, I just have to deal with what's on board and potentially a few plays in the next upcoming turns, and I will be fine. They didn't deploy something like, well, a Zeb, or maybe a General Dodonna plus something, or a Rebel Assault plus General Dodonna, or whatever it is you could play on turn 4. That's a huge game, or maybe even just a Steadfast Battalion ECL'd out, right? And that's in a situation where you're fighting a mid-range or a control deck. You might hit 2 or 3 cards. Let's say you're in the aggro mirror. Well, this just does nothing, as you discard maybe no cards, but you kind of discarded a card because this is being played, meaning that let's say you had 3 cards in hand, you kind of just discarded this card for 5 resources. And your opponent maybe discards 1, maybe 2 cards, but they get to deploy things to the board, which is far better for you. And we're not even considering the things that happen when you're playing the mid-range or control deck. And if that's the case, you might be discarding 1 or 2 cards alongside your opponent. And if you're the mid-range or control player and they're playing aggro, this is just an absolute dead card because you're discarding more cards than they are. And remind you, you're paying 5 resources for this card. This is not oh, I paid 2 resources and yeah, it's not the greatest. I have to discard something and they discard 1 or 2. So it's a little bit favorable for me, but I only spent 2 resources on it. I can still deploy other things. No, you spent your whole turn using this card to do almost nothing. This card's absolutely atrocious, and it has not been seen in any list so far competitively, at least top 8, top 16, top 32, that type of situation. Next one, we have an uncommon here in a 2-resource space unit in Cunning Heroism, a 1/1. When played, for each other card you play this phase, give an experience token to this unit, and it is Vanguard Ace. So let's consider the kind of, I guess you say, easy scenario. You played 1 card before you played the Vanguard Ace, and you get a 2/2 for 2 in space. Okay, that's not good already. There are so many different options on 2 resources in space, such as Alliance X-Wing, which is arguably the worst of those options that you could be playing in the same aspect, right? Well, not even cunning, it's just heroism, and you get a 2/3, right? So the kind of middling scenario for this card, where you play another card and you get this, is just straight up worse than one of the most basic space units. But let's say you have a really good scenario. Let's say you're playing a really low to the ground cunning heroism deck, and you've got I don't know, Greedo, and you play Greedo, you play Chopper, you play Sabine Wren, and then you play a Vanguard Ace. Well, great, you've played 3 cards before this, so you create a 2-resource 4/4 in space. Not terrible, but think about that. That requires you to have had 6 resources on the battlefield. That requires you to have 3 other cards in hand on turn 5. And if you're playing the aggro deck, which can support this, your hand's going to be empty by the time you can actually get advantages out of Vanguard Ace. And in the late game, it is a top deck that's completely worthless. It'll give you maybe a 2-2 in the late game, or maybe in the middle game, you get a 2-2, or even a 3-3. But even if you're getting a 3-3 in the middle to late game, assuming you haven't deployed like all your cards in hand, and again, the only way you can make this work is if you play low-costed units, to leverage the fact that you can go ahead and get a decently sized Vanguard unit Ace, right? But that means that you're not playing him in the early stages of the game, or maybe you just drew poorly, and at that point you're probably just outvalued. Anyways, you get a 3-3. Guys, A-Wing just still trades into this thing. And there are other cards that just absolutely outclass it when you consider 3 resources, right? So this card just doesn't actually work nearly as well as you want it to. I've played a lot with this card because I've tried to make it work in limited. And for those of you that haven't played too much limited, that's a space where you are going to be playing some of your lower costed units in later on in the game. And you're not going to be able to kind of streamline your deck super efficiently. And so in a situation where you play like a 2 resource 2-2 or a 3-3 in space, that can actually get some value in, right? Still, I have not seen this card actually perform anywhere near to what I actually want. And almost every single time, I'd rather have just a TIE Fighter, 2-1 for 1 resource. Heck, I'd rather play Alliance X-Wing, as I mentioned, and that's the reason why people are playing Alliance X-Wing over something like Vanguard Ace in Sabine Yellow, for example. Next one is arguably the most pointless card we currently have in the card pool of Spark of Rebellion, and that is Galactic Ambition, a 7-resource villainy event. Play a non-heroism unit from your hand for free, deal damage to your base equal to its cost. Okay, a few things. First off, if you want to cheat something, and I say cheat something into play as in like you want to play something more expensive than this card so you can actually take advantage, or maybe even want to play a 7-resource play with this card. It costs 7. You need to get to turn 6 before you start cheating things into play. And what are you cheating into play? Avengers, Devastators, Relentlesses. Like, these are the cards, are the most expensive cards in the game. And they're only a couple resources away from Galactic Ambition, mind you. The second thing about this card is that it requires you to have this card and the other card in hand, right? So it's a 2-card cost, only for a small resource reduction. And if you're playing this card and you're playing those more expensive cards in your deck, guess what? You've probably just taken 8, 9, at least 10 damage to your base for the whatever you're playing. And you probably just destroyed your own base because of it, right? There's very few times when I get to turn 6, turn 7 on a mid-range or control deck, and I don't have at least, 12, 13, 14 damage on my base unless I'm in the control matchup. And if I'm in the control matchup, well, I've just used 2 cards to play a more expensive threat that your opponent could probably just deal with immediately. The payoff for this is so minimal. We're talking about a couple resource reduction for the cost of 2 cards and massive damage to your base. And that's it. That's all you're getting. Just play a resupply and you can just play it a turn ahead. You play a couple resupplies, you play a super laser tech, guys, you get the Galactic Ambition, and it's just the same thing, except you don't have to deal damage to your base. That's what we're talking about here, right? Let's say you wanted to play like Relentless or something like that. We just need to play a resupply instead of Galactic Ambition. There's no point for this card for the most part. And heck, I mean, you can't even play heroism units in this cards. With this cards, you can't even cheat, off aspect cards into play. What a meme card. Maybe in the future when we see like some really crazy cards, that could heal you up after coming to play a redemption, for example. I don't know, something. I don't know how this card becomes good, and I don't know if it'll ever become good. I just think it's probably the worst card in Star Wars Unlimited at the current moment. The next one we have on our list is kind of a little bit of a hot take. I'm not actually sure what everyone thinks about this card, but it is on the list today as it really just doesn't match well to what any of the decks that are in these aspects actually are looking to do at its cost. So this is I Had No Choice, a 7-costed event in Cunning Villainy. Choose up to 2 non-leader units, and opponent chooses one of those units, return that unit to its owner's hand, and put the other on the bottom of its owner's deck. Now, if we look at the cards, or I guess you'd say the decks that are interested in playing this, or not interested necessarily, because no one's really interested in playing this, but the decks that could play it, we're looking at like Palp Yellow, Boba Green, Boba Yellow, basically any of the Boba flavors, Thrawn. The big problem comes down to its cost, and you'll notice across the entire list, that's a major consideration, is that they are just too highly costed. When you're looking at this card, you're basically getting a Waylay in conjunction with a removal spell, but instead of putting it into their discard pile, so something like a Vanquish, for example, they get it on the bottom of their library or their deck. Here's the problem with this. It comes down on turn 6. And because of that, in your aspects here, unless you're playing a more controlling style of deck like Thrawn or Boba Blue, this card isn't really getting there for you, because in Boba Yellow, Boba Green, you're trying to play more valuable threats and outvalue your opponent in the long run, not play an expensive removal spell and a card that can bounce things that they could just replay at this point. Now, one of the most powerful things about Waylay in Boba Fett, you don't really see it all that often in other lists, is because you can leverage the additional resources from Boba Fett being exhausted, and it's early enough in the game and costs cheap enough to where you can actually deploy that and not really worry too much about your opponent actually deploying valuable threats at this point. Because remember, unless you are going, well, second and don't have the initiative, playing I Had No Choice doesn't really do a whole lot if your opponent can just redeploy whatever you bounced or just play something more valuable. Let's say they play their 7 resource play, and then you play I Had No Choice, bounce it, remove something else, remove that, bounce something else. Well, you just play an overcosted Vanquish in a lot of situations, and Vanquish would have just been a better card to play in these types of situations, almost assuredly. So it suffers a little bit from being its cost and usually having better choices. But this one, again, I'm curious to hear what you all have to say about I Had No Choice. Next on our list, unfortunately, is General Tagge, and I've tried so much with this card, and I will mention this card's going to get a lot better when we get a lot more troopers in the next set. And the combination of different costed, well, units that we can play makes General Tagge a lot better. But he is a 2-resource command villainy ground unit, 2/2. When played, give an experience token to each of up to 3 trooper units. So here's the biggest issue with this card. We don't have a high enough density of trooper units, and even with the ones that we do have, we don't have the right split of troopers to really make a deck that supports General Tagge. And that's the biggest issue. You play this, you don't have enough troopers. You play this, you have enough troopers, but now you can't really play something to back up General Tagge, so you don't have the right resource to cards being played split. Or the most likely option is you play this, you have the troopers, but they've just traded off or died, or they're less value than some of your other opponents' units that they're playing, because troopers aren't all that great, right? Cell Block Guard is decent. Seasoned Shore Trooper is decent. These are like decent troopers, but you don't really get a ton of value. Even if you are getting the experience tokens, you play a 2-resource 2/2, which almost dies to everything and doesn't actually hit in for a lot of damage. General Tagge is almost played in, well, none of the lists that I've seen lately, as generally speaking, if you're putting this in your attack, you either need to play this and act as if it's a 4-resource play or a 5-resource play, or what you end up in a situation is you just don't have any targets for this, and it does literally nothing. The downside on this is extremely low. The upside is a lot higher, and that's where I say set 2 is going to bring a lot of potential to General Tagge, because you're going to get a lot more troopers and you're going to get a lot more resource split. And what I mean by that is you have the correct cards to play alongside General Tagge, right? Just like Sabine, you have things like play Fighters for Freedom, play Heroic Sacrifice, play Fighters for Freedom, follow up with Medal Ceremony on turn 2. You have cards to play in conjunction with the other cards, so you can actually use all your resources every turn, because one of the biggest problems with these trooper decks is that they're low to the ground, not high value units, and you have to rely on these really low costed trooper units to get in the entire way. And unfortunately for us, that doesn't usually happen at all. Next one on our list is probably one of the most unique units in the entire game, as it's one of the only units, if not the only units, that like interacts with exhausted units and allows you to attack with them. It's a 2-resource space unit in command, Frontline Shuttle, 1/3, and its action is defeat this unit. So you have to defeat your own unit, attack with a unit, even if it's exhausted. It can't attack bases for this attack. So here's the biggest thing about this card. If you could attack bases with the attack, I could potentially see some spots with this, as it's just a hyper aggressive ability to ready up a unit, and it's generally decently protected with the 3 toughness in space. There are a lot of things that can kill it, of course, but there's a good chance that you're going to be able to go ahead and attack in for a couple of chip points of damage, action it, and then maybe get a big swing of like 4 or 5 on turn 3 or 4 or 5. The biggest problem is that it's only used as potentially an ambush mechanic. And so the problem with this is that you have to deploy Frontline Shuttle, and then let's say you deploy a future unit. Yeah, you can ambush it out as if you played like a secondary ECL, Frontline Shuttle being your other ECL, but that ECL costs you an additional 2 resources, a card from your hand, and it could have easily just died to a lot of things in the earlier stages of the game. As I said, it's decently protected as a 3 toughness space unit against a lot of the different things like X-Wing, Arc 170s, Cartel Spacers, but it also dies to things like A-Wings, Red 3s, Millennium Falcons. So it's about half and half. It's not like a ground unit which will die to basically everything, right? Like Greedos, Death Star Stormtroopers, etc. So it's better than that. But unfortunately, because it can't attack bases, I don't really see a way where you're going to get a lot of value out of this. And unfortunately, it's one of the worst cards in the entire game. Oh, Chimaera. Oh, Chimaera. This is the next one on the list. We have an 8 resource space unit in Cunning Villainy, 8/7, shielded. On attack, name a card. An opponent reveals their hand and discards a card with that name from it. So you can kind of look at this, and the biggest problem with this is, again, its cost. And you look at it and you compare it to all the other capital ships, all the other big space units that we have, and where is this fitting? At like the absolute bottom. I'd rather play Devastator, I'd rather play Relentless, I'd rather play Avenger, I'd rather play Home 1, I'd rather play a Redemption. Well, blurry camera, guys. I'm coming back. The camera's like, we can't even look at you right now. We need full focus on this Chimaera right now. Whoop! All of those cards do something that's actually relevant when they come into play, right? Devastator kills something. Relentless prevents your opponents from casting or using events. Home 1 gives you an immediate unit on the battlefield. It gives you a board presence. Your Avenger, it comes in, kills something. Chimaera, it comes in, does nothing, probably will survive because it's a shielded unit, but all you're doing is getting some little bit of information from your opponent's hand. You probably will be able to discard something if you're playing Thrawn, but now you're playing Thrawn and Chimaera, and those are some of the worst cards in terms of leaders and units. This just doesn't match up with any of the other options we have from the capital ships. And even if you are playing Villainy Cunning, and you are playing like a more controlling deck, so you want to play a capital ship, well, the problem is if you're playing a more controlling deck, you're probably playing some sort of vigilance-based deck. I guess you could look at like Palp Yellow, which is a list that's come out recently. But again, hey, Palp Yellow, they're running, guess what? Relentlesses, Devastators. Those are the core capital ships. Those are the big space units that they want to run because they're far more relevant, not only in the meta, but also just impacting the board immediately when they come down. And when you compare Chimaera to the other options, and this is one of the reasons why it's one of the worst cards, it just is worse than the other options we have when it comes to the options we have against a lot of the meta decks. And that's why Chimaera just doesn't fit the bill. You might notice a theme about a lot of these cards. A lot of these are rares, a lot of these are very unique, and this next one is no exception. This is a 2 resource event in the Emperor's Legion. Command Villainy, return each unit in your discard pile that was defeated this phase to your hand. So this card's really interesting, as it essentially is Wrath Protection. If someone plays a Super Laser Blast, you play an Emperor's Legion, you get back every single unit that was defeated this phase, which is really, really crazy, right? Let's say you played a Darth Vader before that, you played a couple other units like a Seasoned Shore Trooper, you get your Seasoned Shore Trooper, you get your Darth Vader, you get your Cell Block card back, and suddenly you're sitting kind of pretty, right? No, not really. Here's the problem with this card. A, you have to play this after your opponent's played Super Laser Blast, right? Or a big removal spell, or maybe they traded it off with a lot of units, which means that you're using those resources in this event rather than deploying back to the board. Okay, you essentially are using this as a draw spell, or event, but you are forced to rely on your opponent to deal with your units. And in order for this to even be something that's exciting, you have to return a couple, maybe 2 to 3 to 4 units to your hand. with this to even be something that I'm anywhere near close to be excited about playing, which means that you had to have deployed threats to the board, you had to have traded or relied on the super laser blast to come down, and then it becomes relevant. But even then, you're not going to have the resources capable to rebuild the board usually, because you've used some of them on this Emperor's Legion. And even in the case where you're getting back your entire board off of a super laser blast, it's usually too late. Yeah, you can deploy a couple more threats, right? Let's say you're on turn 7, someone super laser blasts you, you play an Emperor's Legion, you play a seasoned shore trooper, and maybe another, like a Viper probe droid. It's probably too late because someone comes down with an Avenger. Again, this card is just so situational that even in the situations where you might think it's actually amazing, like a super laser blast into the Emperor's Legion, it's usually too late by that point, and the extra cards in hand are not going to be relevant enough for you to actually close out the game and get enough resources and units into play for your opponent to actually stumble across them. Next card is a card I've tried to play quite a few times, and of course I played it a little bit in limited. It's a lot better in limited, but it is an 8 resource ground unit in Vigilance Villainy, an 8/8. When played, exhaust all ground units. It is the AT-AT Suppressor. So this card has a few things wrong with it. A, if you're playing Vigilance Villainy, you have so many better options in big units. The quintessential example is Avenger, but you also have things like Count Dooku, which impact the board and actually remove things permanently. And again, on 8 resources, if you're playing Vigilance Villainy, you have like Super Laser Blast, which just completely deals with all threats. But let's say you're playing more mid-rangey, like a Krennic Green or Iden Green, and you're trying to play things that, well, maybe you already have your units. You don't really want to play Super Laser Blast. Here's the problem. If you have ground units, you don't get to attack into their base with your ground units. If you're behind on board and you're exhausting your opponent's ground units, well, they now can deploy other things to the board in which your AT-AT Suppressor isn't going to be able to immediately trade with, or they just go in a different arena, like a space arena, to deal with you there. This doesn't actually do enough when it comes down for it to be relevant enough. If you look at the other 8, 9, 10 resource plays, they all do something immediately. Again, Relentless, Avenger, Devastator. All these cards either have, Sentinel, they impact your opponent's events and mess up with control decks, or they're just hard removal spells that come down and actually impact the board rather than just providing a brief stall opportunity for you in the ground arena. This is just not at all what you want to see as a controlling player or even mid-range player against your opponent, as yeah, it is a big beater, and yes, it can hit for 8 damage, but unfortunately, there are things like Reinforcement Walker, which is just way better statted, does something immediately, heals you up, and gets you to that later stages of the game. There are things like, again, Avenger, Relentless, that do more things, and unfortunately, there isn't really a spot for these 8 resource, like Ground Assault AT-AT or AT-AT Suppressors. They're just too expensive for what they're trying to do. Lastly is a card that greatly pains me to put on the list, but that is Rallying Cry. It's a 3 resource event in Aggression. Each friendly unit gains Raid 2 for this phase. There are so many things wrong with this card, but let's talk about the ideal scenario. Right? You could play this for 3 resources because you're playing a Sabine Red deck. I've played it in Sabine Red a lot, by the way. And you're going in on turn 4, or let's say turn 3, and you have your Sabine flip turn. You went like turn 1 Sabine Red, turn 2 Red 3, turn 3 you're playing your Sabine Red, right? Or you're playing your Sabine Red. Suddenly you play a Rallying Cry, and boom, each friendly unit gets Raid 2. And let's go even one step further. Let's say you have like the Heroic Sacrifice or another 1 resource play to play on this turn, like R2 or whatever. Yeah, you get Raid 2, and suddenly all of your units attack for a lot. That is the ultimate best scenario. And the only way this even works at all is you're fighting an aggro mirror, and you do have that great curve, and they didn't trade with any of your units, and you're able to attack all of your units into your opponent's base, right? Most often. Because if you're attacking your opponent's units, generally speaking, you would have either already been able to trade with them, or they're just going to die anyways, right? This is the biggest problem with this. In order for Raid 2 to be relevant, you need to attack with it. And so if your opponent sees Rallying Cry or sees you deploy Sabine Wren immediately, they'll probably take a step back and be like, okay, Can I race them? Should I be dealing with their units? And 99% of the time, it's going to be, I have to deal with some of their units. And so even then, you're not going to have your best case scenario, because let's say you play your rallying cry. Like, let's say your opponent wants to see, okay, what are they going to do? Okay, they play rallying cry. Oh, I need to trade with some units. So you're going to get immediately less value. Best case scenario, this is essentially like a 5th copy of For a Cause, right? You use this, you did a couple of extra damage to their base, you got in like 2 to 3 attacks and have dealt 4 to 6 damage. Great. But that's almost never what happens. And again, that very big minor upside, or a big upside, but happens very minor amount of the time, means that you're playing a card that's dead in a lot of scenarios, as you'd much rather just be playing another unit. Keep in mind that this is assuming, right, that you could actually close out the game from this point. Because if you cannot, your opponent's going to have a massive board advantage, because you played a rallying cry for 3 resources while they played another unit to their board with their resources. So unless you use this raid 2 to value trade with your opponent, like let's say you have a Fighters for Freedom and you play a rallying cry to hit their Fighters for Freedom with your Fighters for Freedom. Unless you're doing something like that, you are going to end up with, well, most likely, either a weaker board state after using this event, or in a situation where it just doesn't actually do anything for you because you have no friendly units. The top deck on this is usually just absolutely atrocious. And it ends up being a card that I almost never want to see in my deck. It's kind of like a card like Heroic Sacrifice, where Heroic Sacrifice is a card where oftentimes it's not going to be particularly useful in that specific scenario. But the big difference between that and Rallying Cry is the fact that that is a 1 resource play, and it's also not relegated to having double aggression. That's another thing that we haven't even mentioned too much. Most of the time when you're trying to play this card, you have to play it for 5 resources, and in that point, well, you're just absolutely doomed. There's 5 resources for this card just is way too expensive. There's a reason why we don't see it in any like double red Sabine list for the most part. But that's going to round out our top 10 worst cards that really didn't make the cut. I know there's going to be other options that you can really mention. If you talk about a lot of the comments, as I mentioned, that we kind of omitted, immediately some of the cards that I immediately think of, like Tactical Advantage, for example, the +2/+2 for that phase. Cards like that are just absolutely atrocious. And we can go on and on about poorly static common units. We can talk about some of the colorless units, etc. But in terms of cards that were meant to be a little bit higher quality, meant to have a specific strategy with, but just didn't make it, things like Galactic Ambition. A lot of these cards are rares, by the way. These are cards that are like, oh, you should pay attention to this. These are cards that you can open in your rare slot, and they just do absolutely nothing, or actively make your game plan just totally worse. Like Galactic Ambition, Frontline Shuttles, Emperor's Legion. These are the type of cards that just don't actually do anything for what you're trying to do in your game plan. I know some people will disagree, and that's the beauty of a lot of these cards, is because they're rare, because they're so unique, some people have had a great experience with them because they did the perfect scenario, and it ended up doing something great, or maybe you just got some value out of it, or whatever it is. But 99% of the time you play with these cards and they're going to actively make your win percentage go down, and that's the biggest thing overall. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm sure there's going to be people that disagree, and I'm hoping to hear it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.